Good morning. Thank you for coming out this morning to continue this seminar with Brother Jeff Miller on Christians can be confident about creation. And a lot of the material that Jeff will share with us today involves an area that he has done a lot of extensive research in. And by that I mean not only book learning, but in the field, doing various studies in the fields of geology and paleontology. And Jeff has, in so many different ways, prepared himself and thought through these matters very carefully and crafted very powerful and helpful presentations. And he's come all the way from Montgomery, Alabama to encourage us and share this work with us. And it is just absolutely thrilling. And a lot of the material he's going to share with us today relative to the flood, the world before the flood itself, the world after the flood, is just going to be fascinating because, as we would expect, the world itself, the earth, is going to show in its very makeup exactly what the Bible said happened. We can trust the Bible, we can rely on it, and Jeff has literally dug into the earth to get these presentations together for us. And I'm grateful you're here, I'm thankful Jeff is here, and we'll look forward to the time we have together today. Jeff, looking forward to it.
Appreciate again you being here on this weekend. Again, I know there's a lot of things you could be doing with your time, and hope that this material will be help you to learn some things about the creation around us, and things that will help you to understand more who God is, and also in order to be able to defend the faith better. So we began a journey last night of systematically building the biblical creation model using the actual evidence. We don't have a blind faith. This is coming to the conclusion that the biblical way is the true way, is a journey that involves a lot of evidence. You remember Michael Shermer made the charge. He said for creationists to disprove evolution, they need to unravel all these independent lines of evidence, which he talks about in his book, the evidences that are used for evolution. I have a whole seminar that does that, unravels the independent lines of evidence for evolution, as well as construct a rival theory that can explain the evidence, better than the theory of evolution. And he says that we have yet to do so. We don't have our own model, he says, that can explain the evidence better than evolution. And so that second half of his statement there really is what the goal of this weekend is. So it's our responsibility, remember, both to refute error and to teach the truth, to put in that void we leave whenever we deal with error. That's two different things, and we have to be able to do both if we want to be able to make a solid case for biblical creation in this day and age. So first of all, keep in mind something that we oftentimes maybe don't think about when we're studying Scripture. I hear people say, even within Christendom, that science and religion are really just two separate worlds. They don't really go together. Trying to fit the circular peg of religion in the square peg of science, it just really doesn't work. But science is not an enemy of the Bible. God himself is actually the one that instituted science and commanded us to engage in science. Way back in the Garden of Eden, for example, remember after he created Adam and Eve, he told them to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. That's science. That's what the goal of science really is all about. Romans 1:20 that we looked at last night says that we can learn about God by studying the things that are made. Again, this is science. You're doing science to learn about the things that God has done in the past, for example. Psalm 19:1 The heavens declare the glory of God. Now, why would God say that to us if he didn't want us to look to the heavens and study them to learn about the glory, his glory and his handiwork? This is astronomy. He's encouraging astronomy. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast what is good. This is basically an 8-word summary of the scientific method. And so true science and the Bible are not at odds. God is the author of science. Psalm 111:2 would really serve as a good thematic verse for a scientific study of creation. The works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. So studying the great works that God has done, for example, in creation, this is a great, amazing, very fulfilling a way to learn about God and the things he has done. They're studied by those who have pleasure in them. I think of Genesis 2:19, where God has Adam name the animals, and with that he institutes the field of biology, biological classification or taxonomy. Job 38:33, God highlights the fact that there are laws that govern the universe. All right, so that's physics. Do you know the ordinances or the laws of the heavens, and can you set their dominion, their rule over the earth? Job in chapter 12, verse 8 through 10 says, speak to the earth and it'll teach you. You think about geology whenever he says that. Or God's words to Abraham, look now toward heaven. Count the stars if you're able to number them. Again, we have cosmology or astronomy being encouraged. You have a basic recipe for antibacterial soap that God gives the Israelites in Numbers 19. Chemistry in action. I talked about last night the basic thrust of several of the laws of science are in Scripture, including the first and second laws of thermodynamics, the law of causality, the law of biogenesis. You remember at the end of the book of Job, when God responds to Job and gives him a sermon to humble him about his lack of knowledge, really, about the things that he is claiming and the information he's demanding from God. You remember that God, in his sermon, it's not a Bible sermon, it is a science lesson. And it covers geology, cosmology, astronomy, physics, oceanography, nomology, optics, meteorology, and biology, including the sub-disciplines of zoology, ornithology, entomology, herpetology, botany, and marine biology. It's a massive science lesson. So the Bible speaks often of scientific matters and always does so perfectly accurately. So the Bible and science are in perfect harmony, as you would expect them to be, God having instituted the field of science. So let's talk for a moment about a scientific model. You've heard me mention that term already, and I'll be continuing to use that a lot. So we need to make sure we understand what is a model in science. This is a term that's used to explain the way that we take all of the physical evidence in the universe around us and try to explain it from a certain perspective, a certain kind of storyline. So it's kind of a framework for understanding the universe around us. So it's like a worldview. And so if your model is correct, it's going to be able to explain all the physical evidence within that framework and even make predictions about what's likely going to happen in the future if our model is correct. And so a model will have within it several different theories many times that are strung together to try to explain various aspects of the evidence in light of this bigger model. So the naturalistic perspective, they have a model, a naturalistic model that is basically explaining everything in a purely natural way, nothing supernatural. So there's a naturalistic or evolutionary model, and within it they have theories like Darwinian evolution and the Big Bang theory that they try to explain the evidence in light of this bigger naturalistic model. Well, we have our own model too, where we try to explain all the physical evidence involving not just nature, but supernature, and specifically the supernatural God spoken of in the Bible. So that is kind of our perspective, our model, and we have to be able to explain all the evidence in nature from that perspective if our model is correct. And so again, we've got different theories within the biblical model that are used to try to explain various aspects of the evidence because the Bible doesn't always give you enough information to be able to explain the details. And so we have to have theories that we use to explain certain aspects of the universe in light of the biblical perspective. Now, a fundamental distinction between the naturalistic model and the creation model is the fact that, as we saw last night, unlike the naturalistic model, the evidence demands that there is a supernatural being, and the evidence demands that it's specifically the God of the Bible and that the Bible is His Word. So that already gives the creation model a foundation that sets it apart from the naturalistic model. So we're really just trying to fill in the gaps with the details. And so that's going to involve some theory in order to do that. So in our first two sessions, we briefly established the first three planks in our systematic construction of biblical creation. And so now we want to look at the next couple planks today. What does the biblical creation model actually claim with regard to the origin and history of the universe, specifically things that would force us to interpret information today in light of those events? And can this model actually do science? Is it a valid scientific model that allows us, for example, to be able to make scientific predictions? And we'll talk about that some later. All right, so if we're going to build the biblical creation model, we got to start in the Bible, and we find that there are two key events that are essential to making sense of the universe around us. And if we don't understand that those things happen, we're going to totally misinterpret everything. And that is the creation of Genesis 1 and the flood of Genesis 6 through 9. Now, we can't observe today creation or the global flood. So these are events that we study as what we call historical science. So events of historical science can't be observed today. The naturalistic model has historical science too. The Big Bang, spontaneous generation of life, the evolution of all species from these former species, ultimately with a common ancestor. These aren't things that were observed. That's historical science. And the creation model has historical science components as well. And since we can't observe those events, we have to make theories about what happened in some cases. The biblical creation model, again, being different because we know that creation and the flood happened. It's just a matter of trying to develop theories to explain the details. So we have to keep in mind that while the Bible does explicitly say God created the universe out of nothing and there was a global flood, it doesn't explicitly tell us everything that happened in those events. It sometimes will give us clues that'll help us to surmise what might have happened scientifically, but we oftentimes can't know for sure. And so we need good theories to explain the physical evidence if we want to be able to defend the Bible and if we want to try to understand more about what God actually did. The great works of the Lord are studied by Him. All right, so I want to travel through the text of Genesis and Genesis 1 through 11 in this session and the next two sessions to see what we can draw from the text that will help us develop a scientific creation model. And we're going to move pretty quickly through this, and so I hope you ate your Wheaties. I recommended that last night. Eat your Wheaties. But hopefully you'll enjoy this scientific journey. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very first verse of the Bible, we're given an important statement that has implications in our model, our whole perspective about what happened at the very beginning, the first day of the universe. First of all, we notice that there is an engineer, the ultimate engineer of the universe that designed and created it. In the Hebrew, it's this being Elohim, which is plural, by the way. As opposed to Big Bang cosmology, the universe didn't create itself, which would violate the first law of thermodynamics. Instead, there's something outside of the box, Elohim. And therefore, that someone had to be a being not part of the universe because he created the universe. So he's outside, above the universe, outside of that imaginary box we talked about last night. So he's not natural, he's supernatural, being outside of the box. So what we can know about him is limited to whatever he tells us about himself or whatever we can learn about him from studying the things he created, which again isn't always easy. We saw that last night because his creation, for example, has been corrupted over time. Now, to fill out our model here, we can jump to some other passages that give us some more information about this initial creation event. For example, concerning Christ in Colossians 1, it says, "For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible." And so we tend to think about Creation Week and maybe think particularly about God the Father whenever we hear God created the heavens and the earth. The Holy Spirit seems to be alluded to there in verse 2. But according to this passage, as well as John 1:3 and Hebrews 1:2, Jesus is actually one through whom the universe is created. He's there in the beginning doing this work. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. We see from also Hebrews 11:3 some other interesting information here. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. So imagine that concept. Psalm 33, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He spoke and it was done, he commanded and it stood fast." So the universe is somehow spoken into existence, even though God doesn't literally have a mouth. And yet these words with omnipotent power backing them are stated that somehow brings everything into existence out of nothing. First law of thermodynamics says that, that how we've observed things happening in nature is that nothing can come into existence on its own. Nothing can create itself. The only way you can get something from nothing is if there is someone outside of the box that puts the material in that box, which is what verse 1 tells us happened. Then we take note of the words "in the beginning." In the beginning of what? Well, the beginning of everything Moses is about to talk about. And so the beginning of the whole universe, and notice that would again, as I alluded to last night, include time as well. So recall that time itself has to be a created entity. Titus 1:2 speaks of God's promise of eternal life, a promise that the text says was given before time began, of course alluding to the creation of the universe, which includes the time dimension. And remember, time has to be created, otherwise you would have to say that time exists outside of God and that even he is subject to it since he didn't create it. Now obviously we're temporal beings. We're beings that are created in time, and so it's really even hard for us to envision a realm where there is no time. What does that look like? But God's realm apparently doesn't have time unless he chooses to create it there. And so there's not even such a thing as before God, because that would imply the existence of time in his realm. We also note from this verse that the heavens, which would be our modern concept of space, that had to also be created by God, even though there was nothing in it initially. And so notice the creation model would argue that space itself is not nothing. It's something that had to be created, the space that everything ultimately is put in. And also notice that the first things that God creates before anything else in the universe are time, the earth, and space, along with water. And this immediately contradicts evolutionary thinking, which has, for example, the earth coming about over billions of years, way after the Big Bang, way after other stars are around. And it's according to the Big Bang model, the earth wasn't around in the beginning. It's around billions of years later and even beyond, after the stars and so forth. We also can infer that the earth must be special to God. Here's an important concept. Nothing that an omniscient, rational being would do would be expected to be random or pointless. He's going to have a reason for everything he does, a purpose. And he chose intentionally to create the earth first before anything else in the universe. And we know that it was to earth. He had already predetermined to send Jesus as a sacrifice, Ephesians 3:11. And so this is surely significant, and it would cause us to theorize that the earth may be in a special place in the universe because it's special. Now, this would immediately go against modern thinking about the cosmos, accepted by the bulk of Big Bang cosmologists. They firmly believe in what's called the Copernican principle, right? Nicholas Copernicus is the guy that said, hey, the earth is not the center of the solar system, the sun is. And so he developed the heliocentric model, and the Catholic Church ultimately thought this was heresy, this concept that the earth wasn't the center of the solar system. And so now there's the Copernican principle, and it basically says the earth is not special, it's not in a favored place in the universe, it's just an accident and is average. And so the creation model would be fundamentally different from secular models in this assumption. Just because the earth is going around the sun, it doesn't mean that it's still not in a special place in the universe. Notice also that from the moment when the heavens and the earth are created, what we mean is that three-dimensional space is created. So length and width and height are created in addition to the time dimension. So it's hard to envision a realm where there is no such dimensions. The spiritual realm apparently doesn't have length, width, and height unless God again chooses to create that. So there is no over here and over there. There's no big and small. It's also possible that other dimensions were created that are as yet unknown. Also on the first day, we read, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And so notice the earth was apparently initially covered, possibly made completely of water. This again goes against Big Bang cosmology, which suggests that the earth was initially molten rather than being covered or made of water. And then finally on day one, of course, you have God creating light, which is pretty much all we emphasize in our kids' song. Day one, God made light when there was none. But notice this is almost an afterthought when you think about all the other stuff that he's doing on this day. Some naturally ask, well, what kind of light are we talking about here? How can there be light? You don't even have the sun around until day 4. Well, we know that light exists in many different forms, some of which you can't even see with the naked eye, from ultraviolet light to X-rays and infrared light, radio waves. So if the earth had a core and a mantle at this point, you might expect light even beneath the earth. Either way, the physical entity of light is made, which would include the light spectrum. But when you look at the text, you have some more details here. Apparently, this light is directional. Some say, well, this light has to do with the initial Big Bang. Well, you read the actual text, you see that doesn't fit here. Verses 4 and 5 indicate God divides this light and defines what we mean by day and night based on this division. And he then uses the words evening and morning in conjunction with those words that he just defined, which makes no sense if we're talking about the light of the Big Bang. So whatever this light was, it's used as a means to mark days by, and so apparently the earth's rotation had begun in order to be able to use the terms day, night, evening, and morning for the earth. So we don't know exactly what this light was. This could have been even just a temporary supernatural light that ended whenever the sun is created on day 4, in which case, if that's the case, no human ever saw it because humans aren't even around until day 6. But it's interesting that it was important enough to God to have light around at the beginning, distinguishing day and night, before he had even taken the time yet to create the sun. And remember, God wouldn't do something like that without reason, without a purpose. We also gather from the text that the creation days had to be normal days, literal, approximately 24-hour days. I say approximately because it's possible that the Earth's rotation isn't exactly to the second what it was at the very beginning. The Earth's rotation can be affected by meteorite impacts and so forth that can slightly adjust that. It's sometimes easy to forget that Moses is writing in roughly 1450 BC, writing to a specific group of people, an audience, that would have had a specific understanding of the terms that he's using. And remember, God is going to want to communicate with us in a way where we can understand him, right? There's information he wants us to get and understand. And so it stands to reason that he's using the terms in the way that his audience would have understood these terms. And there's no doubt that his Jewish audience would have understood these days to be normal, literal days, what we would say a rotation of the earth. This isn't eons of time. Their Sabbath rules are based on understanding this concept. And observing those days incorrectly meant their execution. which is what is commanded by God in one instance there in Judges 15. So give the Bible to a 6-year-old, ask him to read Genesis 1 and see if he gets, the gap theory or the day-age theory out of that. It's not going to happen, which is why people didn't get those things out of Scripture until Darwin came along, popularizing evolution, and Hutton came along, popularizing uniformitarian geology, which require long periods of time. Well, whenever we assess uniformitarianism and Darwinian evolution, which is what I do in that evolution seminar, we find that the alleged evidences for these are non-existent or weak at best. There's no reason to disregard the clear layman reading of the text here. And ironically, as though to make sure his audience understood that he was talking about normal days, he uses the terms evening and morning repeatedly throughout Genesis 1 in conjunction with the Hebrew word for day there, which is yom. And so these words occur 348 times in the Old Testament, and every time they're used with yom in the literature style of Genesis 1, they always refer to evenings and mornings of literal 24-hour days. He also modified the word day with numbers. Evening and the morning were the first day, the second day, and so forth. In the over 200 such occurrences in the Old Testament, the meaning of yom is always a normal 24-hour day. Now, his audience would have understood that he meant a long period of time if he had used a different Hebrew word like dor, for example, which means a long period, a generation. He doesn't do that. He's very specific and used practically every means possible to make sure that we get the meaning of what he's saying here. And interestingly, he uses evening and morning even though the sun's not around yet. It's as though he was wanting to make sure that just because there's not a sun, that we didn't get the idea that you can squeeze evolution in here some way, that these aren't normal days, that concept's been missed by, for example, the modified gap theory guys and some of the multiple gap theory teachings. So all that's day one, right? Now we move on to day two. God creates a firmament, literally in Hebrew, an expanse. And interestingly, 2 Peter 3:5 adds some insight into what the earth might have been like. At the beginning, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God. And so commentators are hazy on the meaning of this verse. It seems to be suggesting that God makes the earth using water, which would explain why at the beginning darkness is on the face of the deep. Verse 2, the deep, a term associated with water, and why the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. But regardless of what's going on here, God creates this firmament, which we generally understand to mean the atmosphere above, although there's some discussion among young earth creation cosmologists. They give a totally different slant on what this could be saying, which we could go into, and I've got material on that, but we won't get into that for now. What about day two and the vapor canopy theory? You probably heard of this term. At least you've heard of the concept, even if you don't know this term, this theory. I grew up hearing about this theory and even thought it made a lot of sense. And this is the concept that, this was several decades ago this originated. And the concept is that the waters above the firmament were kind of like a big bubble around the earth. And theoretically, it would create a greenhouse effect that would make for a warmer, healthier environment, and so more plants, maybe larger life with extended lifespans. It would help explain the warm, uniform climate that the fossils indicate existed. It would shield the earth from cosmic rays, and it would allow for a lot of water to be stored up there that then came down in the flood, and even allow for the idea that how there could be no rain between creation and the flood, which was argued to be being alluded to in Genesis 2, 5, and 6. And this canopy would potentially, again, hold a lot of water that would be the water of the flood. Well, this theory has fallen on hard times because young earth creationists, including the guys that helped originally develop this theory, as they've done the scientific research on it, they've run into some major obstacles. Like they can't figure out, for example, a way where the greenhouse effect that would be created by this canopy would be, it's so high that it would destroy all life on the planet. And they can't figure out a way to physically hold the water up there without God just holding it like that. And we also have found evidence of what seems to be fossilized rain droplets in the pre-flood layers, what appears to be in those layers that would suggest there's already rain going on, which really makes sense. If you've got the laws of science working there in the pre-flood world, then you expect evaporation and therefore clouds, and you're going to have rain. We also know that there's rivers that exist in the pre-flood world, according to Genesis 2, 10 through 14. And these rivers, of course, are generally the products of the water cycle, which involves rain. And so if there was some kind of canopy of some sort, it probably isn't what's being alluded to in the separation of the waters here. The firmament here could just be the space between the liquid water on the earth and then the atmosphere above, which is how it has been generally understood for centuries. Day 3, God says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, let the dry land appear, and it was so. And it's easy to jump over this verse and not think through the possible geological implications of what's going on here. So the earth's crust is apparently created under the waters by this point. Now, so how does he make the dry land appear exactly? Does he scoop the land up into one place? And if he does that, then you could have mudslides that immediately begin, therefore starting to affect any kind of critters or plant life that are created later on in that day. This also would lend support to the idea of the supercontinent Pangaea. So if you have all of the water gathered into one place, then what does that imply about the land? So that may imply that it's therefore in one place as well. Pangaea, or possibly the supercontinent that we think really preceded Pangaea, which is Rodinia. Now, some argue that there was absolutely no death prior to Adam and Eve's sin, including no animal death. And they'll point to, for example, Romans 5, where it says that death entered the world due to sin. But if you look closer at Romans 5, it's clearly talking about the death of humans. This isn't talking about animals. Notice that death spread to all men. Why? Because all sinned. Okay, this isn't talking about animals. They don't even have a soul. Unlike humans, they're not made in the image of God. So there wouldn't necessarily be a problem with certain kinds of death prior to the fall. Since animals aren't created in the image of God, then animal death isn't in the same category of significance as human death, which is why Jesus said concerning plant and animal life, are you not of more value than they? Which I'm sure the animal rights people don't appreciate. Further, notice Genesis 3:22. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil, and now lest he put out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever, therefore I'm kicking him out of the garden. So notice that the reason that Adam and Eve would have lived forever, it's not because their bodies were made in such a way where they would have allowed them to live forever, as though God created the human body with the intention of it just on its own being immortal. And nor was it the case that God was just directly, supernaturally sustaining their lives forever. No, they would have lived forever because of eating from this special tree. And what happens if they don't eat from the tree? Well, they're going to die. And so it stands to reason that entropy and the second law of thermodynamics is already in effect on the earth. And so death is at least possible for anything that's not eating from this tree on the whole planet. And so entropy is in effect, so death is going to be a natural result for anyone or anything that doesn't eat from this tree. So any living thing that's not eating from the fruit from this tree wouldn't live forever. And logically, many animals aren't going to be eating from this tree. Think about, for example, the ocean-dwelling creatures. And so animals are not all sequestered there to the garden. And so when we consider that animals aren't created in the image of God with immortal souls, they're not promised to be able to eat from the tree of life in heaven, then it would stand to reason that the tree of life wasn't intended for them in the first place. Animals weren't intended to live forever. It would seem that they could die from the beginning. Now this is significant. This is a place where virtually all the creation scientists that I study with in the field don't get this. The denominational world around us is totally off on this, and they would use the fact that there was no death prior to the fall as a big argument against evolution, which requires death before the fall. And they would say this proves that evolution couldn't be true, and I'd say that's just not a good argument. I don't think that's what the text is saying here. Now, interestingly, concerning the tree of life, from a scientific perspective, it apparently acts like an anti-entropy tree, an anti-decay tree, maybe healing Adam and Eve of any of their aging or dying components within their bodies, which then gives them eternal life. And interestingly, Revelation 22:2 figuratively describes the tree of life in heaven as having leaves with healing powers. Now, also on day 3, of course, the plants are created according to their kind. That's an important phrase that we'll look at in a moment. Notice the sun isn't around till day 4, and so if the days here are long periods of time, then the plants couldn't have survived because the sun isn't even around until the following day. So photosynthesis wouldn't be occurring for a long period of time. And of course, if the days are long periods of time, then any plants that require symbiotic relationships with the flying insects to pollinate them and so forth, then all those plants would die because the flying creatures aren't made until day 5, even further removed from the sun. All right, day 4, God creates the stars, the sun and the moon. The stars here would include the modern concept of what a star is, how we've defined that today, like the sun that has its own inherent light. But this would also include, into the Hebrew definition, the planets, the comets, and so forth, any of the celestial bodies that reflect light and give light on the earth, verse 14. Some of the purposes of the stars are stated here, that is to give us light, to rule the day and the night, to divide day and night, to give us a system of reckoning time. That's important. So it's for signs, seasons, days, and years. And so with these purposes given, you would expect light from distant stars already is in place by day 6 because humans are going to need that light for these purposes. And notice that would include light from stars that are billions of light years away from us. In other words, there are some stars that we think are so far away, it would take billions of years for their light to reach us. And when it does reach us, it's showing us things that happened to those stars billions of years ago, if that light traveled to us in a natural, normal way. But regardless of how it's done, all of that light has to already be in place to Earth by the time humans needed it on day 6. And creationists have several theories about what is going on there. I have an article that surveys some of that on our website. Days 5 and 6, God creates water, air, and land creatures, so items worthy of note. According to verses 29 and 30, God apparently made animals and man initially to be herbivores, and then they change at some later point. So while animals may have been able to die naturally from catastrophic events, they apparently weren't meant to kill and eat each other in the beginning. I would suggest maybe they were more like omnivores that could go either way with meat or plants, vegetation, but apparently initially are only eating vegetation. Now, how long things stay that way is not clear. The fossil record indicates that animals are already carnivorous by the time of the flood, 1,600 years later, because in the flood rock layers we see evidence of carnivory. For example, we've got a mammal that has a dinosaur in its stomach, fossilized in its stomach. And so they're, at least by the time of the flood, they're eating meat. And notice also that dinosaurs are land creatures along with humans. And so according to the Bible, humans and dinosaurs aren't separated by 63 million years, which is what the evolutionary model would say. We coexisted. And we have archaeological, historical, and even recent fossil evidence that verifies that truth, which we might look at a little bit later on. Notice again, according to the text, that God creates kinds of creatures. The Hebrew word there is mene. This isn't species. And he tells the earth to reproduce life according to its kind. And the same idea is expressed in Galatians 6:7. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. All right, this is obvious. You're not going to get a bird from a dinosaur. Whatever you sow, that's what you're also going to reap. And so we'll explore this a little bit more in a few moments. So standing back, looking at the big picture creation week, notice first of all that the date of the creation week is not given. We're told that it was in the beginning. We're told how long it took. But then you have to look elsewhere to determine when all of this was relative to today. And notice also that God could have done all of that in a moment. He could have done it in 6 seconds. He could have done it in 6 billion years. He chose to do it in 6 days. And again, that must be significant or he wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't do anything without reason. And so when we stand back and look at what he told us about the creation week, and you start thinking, why did he do it this way? We see, for example, in Exodus 20:11, one of the reasons is he set up the normal definition of a week, where you have 6 days of work, 1 day of rest, which led to the very important Jewish Sabbath regulations later. We also infer that God must have wanted to emphasize certain distinctions in the created order, which is, again, the opposite of what the evolutionary model would suggest, where everything really is related, it's just degrees. But God emphasizes their separate origins for the swimming things, the creeping things, the land creatures, the flying creatures, the plants. The earth and the stars and planets are created separately. So the earth isn't the eventual result of a cosmic evolutionary process starting with a big bang. Flying creatures don't evolve from the land-dwelling dinosaurs. Land-dwelling reptiles don't evolve from the swimming fish. And so there seems to be things that God wanted to emphasize about creation. Why else would he tell us about his creating all these things on distinctly separate days? So there's significance to that. There's a message God is conveying. No doubt he's anticipating evolutionary ideas, which, keep in mind, precede Charles Darwin by millennia. There's been evolutionary ideas around for millennia. God knew the naturalistic model is going to have some form of evolution attached to it always. And it's as though he wanted to emphasize we're different. The creation model is fundamentally different from evolutionary model. You can't harmonize these two. Now, if it is significant, the way that God explained how he did this with these distinctions, then the evolutionary model detracts from the message that God is clearly determined to give us. So theistic evolutionary models can detract from the message here. Now that makes theistic evolution a very dangerous idea in going against the message God is trying to convey. Moving into chapter 2, we have garden life. And notice that chapter 2 essentially builds on the day 6 events of chapter 1. It goes back and gives some important details. And this is something Moses does at least 3 times in Genesis, where he'll give the big picture and then he'll go back and talk more about some particular event that happens within that big picture. So he does this later, for example, at Babel as well. And he does a lot during the flood narrative. So Moses finishes chapter 1, gives the big picture. He then goes back, zooms in on the events of day 6, because this is significant. His crowning creation and what really it's all about. And so there hadn't even been rain yet, and God hadn't even created man yet, chapter 2, verse 6. And so this is telling you that this is before day 6, either the day of day 6 or right before that. And so there hadn't even been time yet for the water cycle to begin enough for there to be water from rain going on. Instead, you read about this mist. So God creates Adam from the dust, not from an ape-like creature, and God brings Adam to life. He's described in chapter 1 as being made in the image of God, in his likeness, and this distinguishes him from the animals and highlights a fundamental distinction between humans and animals being less value than humans. The world around us is more and more disagreeing with God about this. And they're saying we're just animals just like them. There's really no big difference. But again, this is a very big distinction between the creation model and the evolutionary model. Humans, for example, have an immortal soul, have free will. Here also the creation model, again, parts further from the evolutionary model, because they would say life just spontaneously sprang into existence from non-life. This is called abiogenesis. It goes against all of the available scientific evidence. It takes a blind faith to think that can happen. But according to the creation model, life doesn't spring into existence. Rather, God is the author of life. He gives to all life, breath, and all things. It doesn't create itself. God puts Adam in the garden, the text says, to tend and keep it. All right, so this is part of paradise, to work. Some people think, oh man, it would be so paradise if I didn't have to work. Well, you don't understand paradise according to the Bible. There's going to be a lot of work to do in heaven. That's part of paradise as God defines it. And he gives instructions to Adam and by the way, we better make sure as parents that we're teaching our kids to love work. Otherwise, they're not going to like heaven. All right, the work ethic is totally gone in our society, and we can't allow that to happen in the church. Anyway, God gives instructions to Adam and tells him which fruit he can and cannot eat. He creates the land creatures, lets Adam name those. And so notice the implications here. The universe is created with an immediate appearance of age. This is essential to making sense of the world around us. Adam is created with an immediate appearance of age. He's not a fetus or a zygote or something. He could communicate. He can understand God's prohibitions. He can tend and keep the garden. He can name the animals. He can procreate, which God commanded him to do. So if an anthropologist came along to Adam on day 7 and said, hey, how old are you? Adam would say 1 day. And the anthropologist would say, no, you're lying. There's no way you're 1 day. Look at all these things you can do. If a geologist came along and dated a rock on day 4, his measurement could give him an age of millions of years. And yet it's only 1 day old. And the geologist says, hey, what's going on here? I think these are millions of years old. God says, no, I created it yesterday. And the geologist says, you're lying. And God's like, you haven't even been created yet anyway, so what do you know? So light, again, is already in place for Adam and Eve to be able to tell time. Trees are already bearing fruit in order for Adam and Eve to be able to eat it. Right? See the importance of this concept. The entire universe has already got to be mature. Tree rings are already going to be in the trees of the earth because tree rings are needed to provide strength to trees if they're fully grown and mature. And otherwise, the tree's just going to fall down. Radioactive rocks would likely have both parent and daughter elements in them, making them appear older than they are. So understanding this mature creation idea is essential to making sense of the universe. Otherwise, you're going to get wrong. You're going to draw wrong conclusions about the age of anything if you don't recognize that some things were created supernaturally mature. They're already fully grown. Notice again, God instructs Adam to name the animals. And there's significance to this scientifically. Recall taxonomy from biology. This was probably your favorite class in school, right? So this is where you're classifying living creatures with your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. This is fundamental to biology, organizing creatures as we discover and study them, trying to figure out what's related and so forth. And apparently this was important to God, once again, because he institutes the field of biology by having Adam do this. Again, why would he do that? Again, it's as though he's wanting to send a message that you've got all these creatures here and they're different from each other, unlike what evolution would suggest, that everything is just kind of degrees of differences. Though there's fundamental distinctions. And so Adam names, organizes these creatures that God makes. So this is an important aspect of biology. It's important to creation biologists. And notice an important idea here, the word kind that's there in Genesis 1. God creates creatures according to their kind. What does that mean? It was once assumed by creationists that this meant the modern concept of species. And now we've backed off of that. Species is something we've only defined in the last couple hundred years. This goes way back before that. The diversity, the variety we see of animals today would not have been around at the beginning. For example, we've bred all kinds of various dogs, just that weren't around even just a few hundred years ago. And we even have evidence that within the dog, things that we call different species of dog actually can come from each other, like a wolf can bring about your domestic dog breeds and so forth. So living creatures have within them an immense amount of genetic potential for diversity within these basic groups, kinds. So extrapolating backwards, we infer that there would have been a lot fewer basic types on the ark, probably a representative of just the dogs and the cats and the elephants, creatures with the genetic capability to bring about all the diversity that we see today over the last 4,000 years or so. So creationists today understand the Hebrew word for kind, which is mean, may be more closely related to the modern classification of family or genus. So representatives of each of the genus, for example, may be on the ark. And there seems to be a barrier above that no creature can cross as it's diversifying. You can't get a dog from a cat or a lion from an elephant, but you could get a house dog from a wolf-like animal, suggesting they're in the same kind. Now, if you think about it, though, over the last few decades, biology has been completely monopolized by evolutionists. Most people don't even know anything about creation biology. So if a person is studying biology in school, even if it's in a Christian school system, even one of our Christian universities, their Church of Christ universities, even if they don't even teach evolution, they're still going to tend to be being taught biology through the lenses of evolution, whether or not they're teaching evolution, because it's hard to make a complete separation because of how far evolution's tentacles have spread in biology. In fact, the entire classification system today is based on the assumption of evolution. And so, for example, consider what's called cladistics. This is the fundamental method of classifying that is being used today in biology. Animals are arranged on what's called a cladogram, like this one on the screen, based on the similarities that different organisms share with other organisms. So, for example, let's say you take a few animals, turtle, lancelet, trout, lamprey, salamander, and wolf, and you want to figure out how to classify these creatures on the cladogram. And so you look at the big similarities. All these creatures have a vertebral column. That's significant, except the lancelet. And so it falls out at the first level in your cladogram because it's not similar to the others in this key feature. So it's considered less related. And then you notice all the remaining animals have jaws. That's significant, except the lamprey. It falls out next. The rest have 4 legs, except the trout. That's significant. The trout doesn't have legs. The rest have an amniotic egg, except the salamander. And so you continue in this way, and you notice that as you move to the right on the cladogram, the organisms are becoming more and more similar, and that helps you to figure out if they belong in the same family, genus, and it helps you to see something else. Notice a fundamental assumption of this entire method. It assumes what we call continuity. What does that mean? Well, this chart and what scientists infer from it, it assumes by the way it was designed that all creatures aren't just similar, they're similar because they're related, however distantly. Because after all, everything evolved from the same single-celled organism, the same ancestor. And so by the very nature of the chart, the way it was designed, every living thing can fit on this same chart somewhere, because by definition, everything is related. We all descended from common ancestors making us related. It's just a matter of degree. So everything must fit on here, even if it really doesn't belong in the same chart, because this is a method that assumes the naturalistic evolutionary model by design. So the cladogram method, which is common today, isn't designed to detect discontinuity. So distinctions between living creatures that would help us to identify the separate cladograms that could be made, for example, which is the way God originally created it, that existed before even the diversification process started. So without those discontinuities, we can't determine the true biological history of life on Earth. You're going to draw completely different conclusions when you look at the animal life on the Earth. And you can't fully understand proper biological classification. So notice this chart, the evolutionary tree of life. This exemplifies evolutionary thinking, and notice that it fits with the cladogram idea, and Darwin even had a sketch of this in some of his writings. So everything's related. It's all on the same big tree, starting with the simple life at the bottom of the tree. So you just have to determine how similar two living things are to figure out how related they are. Now this exemplifies creationist thinking. And notice it's more of an orchard than a single tree. This is fundamentally different. And notice that discontinuity is just as important as continuity from a creationist perspective. So the creationist has to focus in on differences in order to home in on the true classification as God originally created it, not just similarity, because God creates some things completely unrelated from the beginning. They have no common ancestry. Plants, flying things, swimming things, creeping things, land creatures, humans, all specifically articulated as having been created separately. And again, don't forget, God wouldn't have told us about having done that if it wasn't important for us to know about those distinctions. If we don't know about the distinctions, we're going to draw the wrong conclusions when we're doing biology, for example. So due to all of this, leading creation biologists have totally thrown out the evolutionary methods of classifying things and developed our own classification system that hardly anybody, of course, out there will know about because it's monopolized by evolutionists. And the field has been called baraminology. Ology is the study of, and bara means created, and then mean is the word for kind. So the study of created kinds. And this is a very busy area of creation science where at the peer-reviewed creation science conferences, lots of research going on being presented at these conferences on this subject. Next, God creates Eve from Adam, again, not from an ape. And then you have the infamous scene occurring involving Adam and Eve, the serpent, introducing sin into the world. According to Genesis 3:17 and 18, Adam's sin causes God to curse the earth in a way that causes difficulty for Adam in providing for his family. So eating, which was once easy, just reaching up, grabbing fruit from a tree, now it's going to require sweat. And the ground is cursed with thorns and thistles. So this cursed ground concept has important scientific implications for creation science and apologetics. So evolutionists quibble with creationists and argue that if God designed the universe, and he's this all-good God, why do we have cases of what is called natural evil? So evil in the non-human world, where you've got insects and microbes even, along with your birds, fish, and so forth, that seem to have been designed to do terrible things. They're killing machines, things that we would think of as barbaric, like the emerald cockroach wasp it'll dig into a cockroach and plant its eggs that'll then hatch and eat its way out of the cockroach. I mean, just crazy things we find in the animal kingdom. In some microbial cases where that seems to be all that they were designed to do. So creation biologists dig in and figure out what's going on in these cases. In some cases, it comes down to genetic degeneration, where creatures' genetic information has mutated over time. It's in genetic entropy, and they don't function necessarily the way they originally would have. So remember, the earth is growing old like a garment. Second law of thermodynamics. It's degenerating, Hebrews chapter 1. In some cases, it comes down to displacement, where creatures are displaced from the environment they were created for. They've been pushed out of that, and it causes them to behave differently. So maybe their environment was destroyed by humans, for example, or the flood, or they migrated to a different spot over time. Genesis 9:2 says that after the flood, animals would then fear humans, and that might be alluding to the kind of change that occurred in animals due to the post-flood environment being very different from the pre-flood environment. In some cases, it can come down to just the way God designed them. You have to keep in mind that creatures can be designed to do things to each other. They're not moral creatures that humans can't, because we're different. We're set apart. We're made in the image of God. In some cases, it comes down to diversification. So just the change that has occurred within the kinds that were created over time due to the genetic potential God built into their genomes. But in some cases, it comes down, this natural evil can come down to this passage. Whatever it is that God did to the earth that cursed it, the changes that he made due to Adam and Eve's sin. All right, creationists have to be able to do more than poke holes in the evolutionary model. We need to have our own model. And so we're now all the way through Genesis 1 through 3. And in our next session, we're going to start digging into the flood, which is a lot of fun. All right, thank you for your attention. Jason, you want me to let them loose? When are we supposed to start? 10:20. All right, thank you for your attention.
Thank you for being a part of this mid-morning session. Corey's been involved with some very important matters, but now he's back into the booth upstairs, so we can get rolling here in just a second. Larry brought his coffee in here, so that's okay for anybody that wants to go get a cup of coffee. Be in good shape. Before you leave today, check out the materials from Apologetics Press. It's so wonderful to have Jeff Miller with us from Apologetics Press, and you'll see on the table out there a catalog. And if you take anything home today, take this catalog, and you'll see resources that you can consider maybe later on. We have an opportunity with graduations coming up real soon, and a lot of these resources are just fantastic for graduates and helping build their faith. Jeff has brought a number of his copies of his new book, Flooded, and this is going to contain a great deal of information that he's going to cover in our second session this morning and later today as well. And so you'll appreciate that. If this is something you would like to study further or pass on to someone else, it's written in an excellent and understandable way in dissecting these scientific matters that are of interest to all of us who believe the Bible and want to strengthen our faith, and especially the faith of our young people. And we're so thankful for the work that Jeff continues to do, and that he has graciously shared his weekend with us and has left Julie at home to keep the fort together along with their 5 children, and we're so thankful that he has decided to spend this weekend with us. Jeff, we look forward to it.
All right. So in this session, I want to study the second key event in world history that we have to consider if we're going to make sense of the world around us from a biblical creation model perspective. We want to properly interpret the evidence. So, starting where we left off, Adam and Eve are evicted from the garden. And so we have now a totally different kind of world. So you have the original world that was the pre-sin world, and now the world changes that they're going to be dealing with. Obviously, life is going to be very different from humanity, and Scripture is almost completely silent about this kind of second world period over the next 1,600 years. A world that, again, we can't really experience today, a very different world. We'll see information about that. Moses essentially pushes fast forward, and we fly through 16 centuries up to the flood, and the lifespan of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah given in chapter 5. So those Bible believers who want to argue for an old earth as promoted by uniformitarian geology will sometimes try to add gaps into these genealogies to try to make the Bible accommodate an old earth. And in response to that, besides the fact that dating techniques are based on uniformitarianism, which can be shown easily to be a terrible assumption in geology, you can't trust the dating methods being used. And besides the fact that squeezing time in to the Bible when humans are already on the scene, that's not going to help you make the Bible correspond to geology, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But also the way that Moses articulates these genealogies leaves no room for gaps. Over and over throughout the chapter, he uses this formula where person X lives A years, has person Y, and then X lives B years, and the total life of X is A plus B. So with this formula, he nails down tightly this chronology and allows no gaps in this pre-flood period. So Genesis 5 is one of the primary biblical evidences that the earth has to be relatively young, and it doesn't accommodate modern uniformitarian thinking. So simple math using Genesis 5 shows that they're around 1,650 years from creation to the flood. And In the New Testament, Jude 14 verifies that there aren't gaps in these Genesis 5 genealogies, calling Enoch the seventh from Adam, which again lines up with the Genesis 5 genealogies. Now, it's true that we can't know the exact number of years between creation and the flood because, number one, there are three possible Hebrew texts. You got the Masoretic text, but you also have the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, which all give different numbers. We tend to think that the Hebrew text is the one that's, and for good reason, that it's the one to be trusted. But also we know that Noah doesn't have Shem exactly on Noah's birthday. So Noah doesn't live exactly X number of years before he has Shem. There would have likely been some rounding of a few days or months. Shem doesn't have Arphaxad on Shem's birthday and so forth. So there's some rounding going on with these patriarchs of a few months. But assuming the Hebrew text is correct in its transmission, we can be confident the span of time between creation and the flood is 1,656 years, give or take about 5 years. That's really what we're talking about here. So this is a chart showing the lifespans of each of those 10 patriarchs from Adam to the flood based on the Hebrew text. So you have, again, 1,600 years. And notice that Adam is actually alive to meet all of the patriarchs except for Noah, right? And Methuselah dies the year of the flood. The average lifespan, not counting Enoch, is 912 years. So how in the world do we explain that? Well, this is a clue about life in the pre-flood world and a very different environment, a world which Peter, remember, described as having perished. The world was different, probably talking, potentially talking about more than just the people of the world, but the world itself, we'll see, is very different. So what is this world like in the pre-flood period? Well, remember that the land itself was apparently configured differently, possibly alluded to there in Genesis 1:9. God had all the water gathered together, the text says, into one place, possibly implying the land was gathered as well. And you no doubt have heard about Pangaea, the supercontinent thought to have existed in the past that combined all of today's continents into one. Now, Alfred Wegener is often mentioned in association with this idea, and he was an old Earth guy. But it was actually a creationist several decades before him by the name of Antonio Snider Pellegrini, who was one of the first to suggest that the Earth's continents seemed to fit together like puzzle pieces. And so this is actually his drawing in 1858, several decades before Wegener was developing continental drift theory, which is the idea that the continents drift around on the mantle. But Snider Pellegrini believed the biblical flood may have been what broke up the supercontinent and started moving the continents to where they are today. So continental drift has now been replaced with plate tectonics, which is the idea that it's not just the continents moving, but that the entire surface of the earth, the crust, is broken into big pieces, even under the ocean floor, and these pieces are moving around. And we'll look at that a little bit later. Now, the puzzle piece fit of the continents, that's not the only powerful evidence for Pangaea. Today, scientists, for example, we can use GPS and determine how fast the plates are moving and they're heading. And from that movement, we can then reverse the trajectory and extrapolate backwards and get an idea of where the continents would have been in the past. And so plate tectonic theory is able to explain why, when the trajectory is reversed, they converge and fit together like the big puzzle that Snider Pellegrini drew. Plate tectonic theory explains why, when this puzzle is put together like this, you have matching rock layers that go across the pieces and line up, and even mountain ranges on different continents that are now separated that continue once you put this back together. They all fit together. So the Appalachian Mountains, for example, become the Caledonian Mountains of northern Europe, which we'll look at a little bit more in a moment. Plate tectonic theory explains why There are even matching fossil distributions across these puzzle pieces that are now separated, and several other things. So it has great explanatory power. But how would Pangea fit with the Bible when the rate of motion that we see of the continents today is so slow? It's on the order of centimeters per year, as fast as your fingernails grow. And so it would take eons for the continents to get to their current position. Well, as usual, the naturalistic model is based on bad assumptions. In this case, uniformitarianism. And this is the idea that whatever we see going on today, how fast the plates are moving, whatever we see going on today, it always has gone on that way in the past. There never has been worldwide cataclysmic events that happened that could have changed the speed at which the plates are moving. So if continents are moving apart on the order of centimeters per year today, they must have always moved that slowly, and therefore it must have taken eons for the continents to fit together like this. Well, again, the Bible can be known from the evidence to be inspired. It has supernatural characteristics. So it is a true account of history, which means that uniformitarianism is false. Catastrophism is true, because the flood happened. And so the geologic effects of that catastrophe has to be taken into account if it would have played a role in the movement of the plates. So, but our objective at this point is to consider the implications of the scientific evidence with regard to what this tells us about the pre-flood world. And what we see is that the earth was very different geographically. In fact, there's evidence that there was a supercontinent before Pangea that I alluded to earlier. So when we put Pangea back together, we find that the Appalachian Mountains of the eastern U.S. continue into Europe, becoming the Caledonian Mountains, which is what we see here. But also, when you examine the nature of the rock layers found in those mountains, we find that the mountains have layers in them that were deposited in the flood before they were buckled to form the mountain chain, which means that the Appalachians weren't formed until the flood. So when we understand that mountains form due to the tectonic plates smashing into each other, this suggests that there was a pre-flood continental configuration that converged in the flood to form Pangea during the flood. And so that original continental configuration we call Rodinia, and also suggested by the fact that mountains form as tectonic plates smash. One of the things we'll find as we look at the flood in a moment is that the bulk of the Earth's mountains are likely formed during the flood, which suggests that the pre-flood Earth was probably much flatter. So perhaps rolling hills and plains. But regardless, we can't know much about what that original Earth looked like beyond a few clues, because the remnants of those continents are very small and incomplete. Those places where we can still get down to pre-flood rock. So God completely destroyed that world in the flood. So the fossil record doesn't support evolution. It supports creation in the flood in a powerful way. I could do an entire session just on that. And it teaches us a lot, the fossil record teaches us a lot about what the pre-flood world was like biology-wise. How can it tell us that? Well, we know in the geologic column and the fossil record where the flood begins. There's powerful evidence that fits creationist predictions about exactly where that would be. And it's down in the geologic column at the Cambrian, the base of the Cambrian layers, okay, where what's called the Cambrian explosion happens. And we know where it ends. We think it's at the top of the Cretaceous layers. All right, so what does that tell you? Well, if we study the fossils in these rock layers, then we're getting a snapshot of what animals look like in the pre-flood world up to that point. We're getting a snapshot of what the pre-flood creatures look like. And what we see is that in many cases, they're similar to modern humans, but in some cases, there's some very different creatures that were living. Thinking about the plants are abundant, grew to large and lush size in the pre-flood world. The trees of petrified forests out in northeast Arizona are trees thought to be from the pre-flood world that were torn up and carried to where they are now, buried and petrified rapidly there in the flood. This flooded course that I get to teach the teens out there in Arizona, we get to go out there, they get to study these trees. So the immense coal deposits found in the flood layers highlight how lush the pre-flood world was vegetation-wise. The rock layers in the flood seem to indicate higher levels of oxygen in the pre-flood world. Recall the enormous fruit still growing in Palestine a few centuries after the flood when 2 Israelite men had to carry a cluster of grapes, remember, on a pole between them. And so that kind of thing is probably not unusual in the pre-flood world. The large reptiles of the pre-flood era, of course, are your dinosaurs. This is a Brachiosaurus that they had on display at the British Museum of Natural History. You see me beside it there for scale, shows you how big this guy is. Here's a plesiosaur, so a marine reptile of the pre-flood environment. Again, you can see me for scale over here to show you how big this guy is. This is creepy. Insects were huge as well. So we have fossil evidence of dragonflies, or basically dragonflies with wingspans of over 2 feet, the Meganeura. And this is even worse, millipedes that were up to 7.5 feet long, the Arthropleura. I don't know if you want to ride on that thing or just run. I think I'd run. Today there's 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. There's evidence that it was as high as 35% in the past, which would promote health, life longevity, and so forth. So all of these things we can learn about the pre-flood world by studying the fossil record and geologic column. There's things we can learn about humans as well. We know from Genesis 4 that they're already intelligent from the very beginning because they're even building cities and inventing musical instruments, doing farming and working with cattle and even working with bronze and iron. This is all alluded to there in Genesis 4. This is all before the flood. And we can learn about their appearance to some extent because while the entire human habitat is totally absent from the flood layers, the whole human habitat was blown away. It was apparently completely destroyed. But you can look at what humans look like immediately after the flood in the rock layers right after the flood and get an idea of what Noah and his family may have looked like at the skeletal level. And there's a lot of variety in the humankind, just as there is in the dog kind and the cat kind and every other group of creatures. Evolutionists tend to give new species names to groups that share similarities and they have maybe a very slightly different thing. Like, let's say, Homo sapiens, one of the things that distinguishes us is we have a very pronounced chin. Okay, even though within Homo sapiens we got a lot of people with weak chins. They don't have much of a pronounced chin, and yet they'll tend to distinguish the Homo sapiens species when really there's a lot of variety within the humankind. And that is the case with all of the hominids. And so like Homo erectus, you may have heard of Homo erectus and Homo diminuti and Homo heidelbergensis. And statistical and biological studies done by creationists have showed that Homo erectus and these other hominids are really just varieties of humans from the past that had, for example, a more pronounced maybe brow ridge in the case of Homo erectus and a weaker chin rather than the more pronounced chin that most of us have today. So this is what the fossil record reveals that humans may have looked like at the time of the flood. They were also able to live longer. Why is that? Well, we don't know, but we can postulate, theorize what's going on. Again, you have higher oxygen levels. We also know that, is it possible that there were some lingering effects from the tree of life? If Adam and Eve had been eating of it, but you had to continue eating of it in order to maintain life, there may have been some lingering effects from that. We don't know. There would have definitely been way less genetic degeneration in those pre-flood years because the genome, as God originally created it, was perfect. And so it didn't have any mutation, anything in the genome that is now causing us to have problems that forces us to die earlier. And so genetic degeneration would have been insignificant at this point. A lot less disease and sickness. But a big factor is radiation. The magnetic field of the earth today is not what it would have been in the pre-flood environment. We know that it was much stronger in the pre-flood environment, which would protect the earth. But also, studies by Christian geologists and geophysicists have revealed that the nuclear decay rates of the elements were significantly accelerated during the flood, which would result in an immense amount of radiation being released in a short amount of time during and immediately after the flood. So who knows what that would have done to the human genome. And what's more, besides plants and animals, we know humans of giant stature walked the earth, referred to there in Genesis 6:4, and they continued for some time after the flood, and so we'll look at that later. We know that after the flood, they could reach 6 cubits in a span. In the case of Goliath, what scholars believe to be around 9 feet 9 inches tall. Before the flood, they may have been capable of even greater heights. One other aspect before we dig into the flood itself that we can draw from the text about this pre-flood period, looking at the Genesis 5 genealogies, we can get a rough idea of how long people are living before the flood, at least in the case of these patriarchs that are listed. And we find how much time there is from creation to the flood. Remember, about 1,650 years. So from that information, we can get a rough estimate of how many people may have been on the earth by the time of the flood, based on some assumptions. So if we assume that all of the people were living about 900 years on average, and if we assume that women continued having children for roughly the first half of their lives, as they do today, keeping in mind they may have been able to have kids much longer, 800 years. And instead, if we just assume 450 years, if they start having their children at the conservative age of 25, and we assume that people live long enough to be able to see all of their grandkids, so 2 generations, so with these very conservative assumptions in place, 215 million people would have been a very low estimate as to what we're talking about here. God had commanded them to be fruitful and multiply. And so this is probably nowhere near as many people are on the place, or on the planet. Some commentators have estimates way higher. All right, Genesis 4:26, the last verse of chapter 4, tells us that after Seth had Enosh, men began to call on the name of the Lord. That's an important phrase that's found throughout the Bible, that concept of calling on the name of the Lord. And then chapter 5 gives us, keeping in mind that there were no chapter divisions originally. So you have 4:26, and then it immediately goes into a description of the lineage of Seth and Enosh. And these individuals who presumably were calling on the name of the Lord. And things decline over those 16 centuries. The reason for the flood given in the text is that every intent or intention, ESV says, of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Imagine how bad that would be. It's not that bad in America yet. Because in America, there's still, even the wicked people do some things that are good. But this seems to be suggesting that if these people of the pre-flood world did something good, they didn't intend to. Right? Every intention was only evil. Imagine how bad that would be. So very different from even what we deal with today. How did that happen? Well, the cause of that wicked state is given in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 6. The sons of God, which is an idiom that can mean 2 different things in the Bible, but contextually here, this seems to be referring to the people that were just discussed, the people calling on the name of the Lord. That's one of the meanings of this idiom. They started noticing physical beauty and began prioritizing that more in their marital decisions instead of people calling on the name of the Lord. So the good people start marrying the daughters of men, the worldly people, based on physical beauty rather than spiritual. And so let that be a warning to young people about the qualities we should be prioritizing in dating and marriage decisions. Well, verse 3, notice the phrase, his days shall be 120 years, and some have taken that to mean, well, God's not going to let humans live 900 years anymore. He's putting a cap on how long people can live now, and it's just going to be 120 years. And that doesn't work for a few reasons. Number one, Barnes, the commentator, makes a good point that man in this verse is referring to mankind, the whole race, not the plurality of individuals, but the whole race is going to die in 120 years. So this would be seeming to refer to the flood, which of course is what the context here is. Number two, man kept living beyond 120 for centuries after this statement is made. Number three, it would be strange to say, okay, I'm sick of mankind being like this, so I'm punishing him with only being able to live 120 years. That would be a strange punishment to give. And number four, of course, the point of this whole context is to show how God ultimately punishes the world through the flood. And so the punishment being referred to with the 120 would seem to have to be related to that. So it makes more sense contextually that he's saying, man is wicked, I'm not going to put up with it forever. Notice my spirit's not going to strive with man forever. I'm reaching a breaking point. And in fact, 120 years. You got 120 years to repent, which, by the way, there's the patience and long suffering and grace of God. He gave them 120 years. And then he said, Noah, get to work. So incidentally, when you look closely at the text, you see that Noah is 500 when he starts having Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And by the way, they're not triplets. He starts having those three sons there. He's 600 when the flood comes. That's not 120. So from that, we gather that the statement by God here in verse 3 is made during the genealogies of Genesis 5 just before that. So God apparently made the decision to bring about the flood some 20 years before the birth of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and he talked to Noah before they're even born. And so Noah apparently doesn't have their help for a while in building the ark. And by the way, you know, this would be theoretical too. If Noah is doing what God said to do, being fruitful and multiply, filling the earth, how many other kids does he have by the time he's 500? He could have hundreds of kids, all of whom don't make it, except for Shem, Ham, and Japheth, interestingly. Well, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits is this vessel. And according to scholars, that translates to a football field and a half long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall. He's told to make this ark out of an unknown wood called gopher wood, make 3 levels on it, have rooms for the animals, cover it with pitch so it doesn't leak, put a door in the side of it. And then he's told to install an opening. This isn't really like a window like we teach in our Bible classes, at least the pictures a lot of times show that. This seems to be, according to the underlying Hebrew, something like an opening for light and ventilation that may have gone around the top of the vessel. There was a cubit in height. And according to chapter 8, verse 13, a covering or awning of some sort is put over this opening, which is left until the end of the torrential rain period, and then Noah opens this window-like structure to see the state of things after that. God apparently sends the animals that he wants on the ark to Noah. Noah doesn't have to go hunt these down, and that's significant when you think about the genetic implications of what has to happen here. If Noah has to know enough about genetics to be able to determine which varieties, like which species are going to be the best, which sampling is going to be the best genetically to bring about the diversification that needs to happen after the flood, if he's got to figure that out at that point in history, that'd be an issue. Well, he doesn't have to. God sends them to him. That's significant. So you have a male and female representative of the unclean kinds of animals. According to chapter 7, representatives of the clean kinds as well. Possibly, we don't know if it's 7 or 14. In other words, 7 pairs. I recently saw some pretty good argumentation for the latter, the idea of 14 individuals, not 7. So again, these are representatives of the kinds of animals, not species. So animals from the earth, including, it says, birds and creeping things, which apparently is just in this case talking about various reptiles, maybe some amphibians. Noah also brings food for his family and the animals. And then after loading up, God himself shuts the door and the fireworks begin. And that brings us right up to the flood, the most catastrophic, violent event in world history. And yet God wants us to study this, the great works that he has done, and this is the greatest, at least destructive event. They're worthy of our thought and consideration because they tell us about him. They tell us important things about who God is. And the Bible only gives us a few details about this. It occurred 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. It was global in its extent. It covered everything. The fountains of the deep are broken up, and water comes from above. The mountains rise, the valleys sink. It lasts essentially a year, and that's what you got. And that's not a lot to work with. So when you look up from the pages of Scripture and start looking at the physical evidence in the earth, and trying to figure out how do we explain all this, what else happened in the flood, and how do we defend what the Bible teaches on this, then we get a lot of other interesting information about what occurred here. Does the evidence from geology fit with Scripture? And of course, most of the world says no way. And in fact, a lot, even within Christendom, have argued the flood just could not have been global. Because think about it, there's not enough water on the earth to do this. And so they look, for example, at, if the flood happened, where did the water go from this event? Did God just like make it disappear? I mean, how do we deal with this? Is it in the sky? If you were to take all the water in the sky and release it, we estimate that it would raise sea level about 1 inch. Not a lot of water up there. Is it frozen in the ice caps? Well, if you were to melt the ice caps, that only raises the sea level about 230 feet. Is it within the crust? Well, that's more significant. There's an estimated 6 quintillion gallons of water in the Earth's crust today. So if you pump all that back out on the surface of the Earth, that only raises it another 600 feet. And notice, this is insignificant. We're not even up to 1,000 feet. And the greatest mountains today, we got some that are over 25,000 feet above sea level. And so whenever you look at numbers like this, if you still want to believe in the Bible, people are like, well, this flood couldn't be global. This has to be local. And so Moses must just be recounting what this event looked like from Noah's perspective. So they'll do that and say this has to be local. Well, what we'll find is this can't be a local flood, either based on Scripture or based on science. Science demands this is a global flood. And so we want to look at that. So the first thing I want to do is show you a depiction of what creation scientists have tried to depict of this event as it begins. It leaves out some key things, but it's the best representation I've seen as yet for what we think happened in this event. actually have sound that goes with that too. I forgot to check on that. So modern creation science theory suggests that the water in the flood came from the oceans and from below the earth rather than just from clouds above, which was the thinking decades ago. But keep in mind, it's also incorrect to just view this as involving water, water coming down and the sea level rising. The flood is a major geologic event. The earth is restructured. So the phrase, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, that's significant. So the great deep referring to the depths of the ocean. So we're talking about what sounds like the breakup of the ocean floor. Proverbs 3:20 mentions this as well, stating that the depths were broken up. So the flood is a major geologic event. And notice the text here says that all the fountains of the great deep are broken up. There's more than just one, and they all break up from whatever happens here that begins this. This suggests the breakup of the ocean floor. Now, the order of events is noteworthy. The fountains of the great deep are broken up. The rain is mentioned second, as though it's a consequence of the first, possibly. So what initiates this? What starts this? Well, we don't know. I mean, did God miraculously just directly initiate it? Or does he use physical entities like meteorites to smash into the earth and break up the ocean floor? Well, interestingly, again, as we do science and study the earth, we find that there's a substantial amount of physical evidence that suggests there was a lot of meteorite impacts during the flood. They're found in the flood layers. So secular geologists tell us that there are roughly 200 meteorite craters on the planet that are acknowledged to be definitely from meteorites. And there could be way more, but they at least think 200 of them are. So when you look at where they're found in the layers, the dates that they think that they occurred, and convert that to the biblical time frame, we find that 57% of the confirmed meteorite impacts throughout Earth history struck during the single year of the flood. 57%. Another 23% of the confirmed meteorite impacts date to the period immediately following the flood, from the flood up through the Ice Age up to Abraham. So 80% of the known meteorite impacts occurred during the flood and then during the following few centuries as the earth is calming down. So that's interesting. That's something that you can't ignore. It seems to be a significant part of what's going on. Well, regardless of what starts this, creation geologists have tried to piece together what happens after it begins, based on what we see from geology today. And so we've determined that the interior of the earth is comprised of a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, a mantle, predominantly solid rock. The upper part has some plasticity. And then you have the crust upon which we live. And so looking at the surface, geologists have discovered that the surface of the earth is broken into plates, big chunks that move around, again, on the order of centimeters per year. And so the earth is like a big cracked egg, and the earth seems to be unique in that. It's the only known planet to have plates like this that move around. So if that's the case, then again, that would suggest something special happened here that didn't happen anywhere else. And so creationists believe that the cracking of the egg may have been what started the flood. And there's actually been recent articles by various secular geologists making the argument that plate tectonics may have begun by meteorite activity. So the model that describes the motion of these plates and their effects is called plate tectonics. So how do they know plate tectonics is true? What are they looking at? What are they seeing? Well, there's several evidences for this. We can use GPS to detect the movement of the Earth's crust. I already talked about that with regard to the idea of Pangea. And also, geologists have used dating methods to get the age of the ocean floor. Okay, now their specific ages that they find are all going to be wrong because of the accelerated nuclear decay going on in the flood. But they do give us not absolute ages, but they can give us what seems to be relative ages. Meaning, they can tell us this rock is older than this rock. But they can't tell you by how much. The absolute ages are going to be wrong. But what they find is when you move away from like the mid-ocean ridges, the rocks get older on both sides. They're younger in the middle and they get older as they move away from that, right? Which suggests that you've got new ocean floor coming up that is then moving away, which is what the plates are moving, right? That's what's going on there. And then there's magnetic stripes. So when you're measuring the polarity of the ocean floors, let's say you got a metal detector and you decided to go down to the ocean floor, which I wouldn't recommend doing. All right, but you get down on the ocean floor and you start walking across the ocean floor, it's gonna, if you've got, say, a compass that's detecting where north is, right, with your magnetometers. North and south flip as you're walking. So you go across one stripe and north is where it should be, and then all of a sudden you get to the next stripe and it flips. It's going the opposite direction, which, by the way, tells us some crazy things are going on during the flood. Now, there's only a couple ways to explain what's going on, but all of this is happening in the flood. North and south are flipping. And the only ways to do that is, well, anyway, I won't get into that, but it's crazy. But interestingly, these stripes, again, parallel each other as you move away from these ridges. So again, you've got material coming up, forming new ocean floor, and north is pointed in a certain direction, and then it goes ahead and solidifies and turns into rock. And so all of the grains are, any iron, for example, in the grains are pointing north, and then they start moving away from each other. New material comes up, and all of a sudden, the grains are now pointing the opposite direction because north is now in the south. So you see that happening as this new material is coming in. So powerful evidence, explanatory power from plate tectonics. And of course, maybe the most obvious way to see the existence of these plates is when we mark the locations of earthquakes and volcanoes on the planet. They make a very clear pattern when you map these out. Now, why would earthquakes and volcanoes happen to line up like that, where they're like outlining big pieces of crust? Well, these are the plates. So most geologic activity on the earth is thought to occur along the margins of these big pieces of crust, these plates, as they're moving. They rub into each other, that causes earthquakes. And if they move apart from each other or lava starts coming up, it'll form volcanoes. Mountains are formed as some of these plates ram into each other. So different things happen. Some do what's called transform, where they slide past each other. We see that at the San Andreas Fault out there in California. Did you ever get to go see that out there? Did you ever get to go? Yeah. San Andreas Fault is a transform boundary. Some will diverge. That's where they move apart. They're moving away from each other. So new material, new lava comes up and forms new crust there. And so you see that happening underwater, for example, at the mid-ocean ridges. Some smash into each other. They converge. And so if you have two continental plates converging, it'll form mountains. And if you have a crustal plate converging with an ocean plate, the ocean plate subducts. We call that subduction, where the ocean plate goes under the continental plate, dives down into the mantle, and as that happens, it forms a ring of volcanoes. So mountain building is extremely slow today because the plates are moving so slow into each other. So it would take eons to form mountains at the rate that they're moving today. So if mountain forming takes so long, then how can the evidence fit with the creationist model? How can this be harmonized with Scripture and its description of a young earth? Well, remember we looked at the idea of Pangea. Lots of evidences for that, the puzzle-like fit, the matching rock layers, mountain belts, fossil distributions. The problem with the idea of Pangea, from their perspective, their model, is the time frame. Again, they're using uniformitarianism. The plates have always moved so slowly, is what they're going to assume. So if we use the actual evidence, but without their assumption of uniformitarianism, then what creationists have done is developed our own version that's based on our model, and it's not plate tectonics, it's catastrophic plate tectonics, or CPT. And a young earth creation geophysicist by the name of John Baumgartner was laying the groundwork for this back in the early 90s. when he developed a supercomputer program at UCLA whenever he was doing his doctoral research in geophysics and space physics. And he developed a program called Terra that models the interior dynamics, the movement of the Earth's interior and the mantle, for example. So based on the predictions of his program when he did simulations, other creation scientists, physicists, geologists, biologists, paleontologists, meteorologists joined him in developing this theory, catastrophic plate tectonics, that tells us what may have happened at the beginning of the flood. So there's lots of technical literature on this, but significantly breaking this down, paraphrasing it, before the flood, the plates don't exist. The continents are not separated. The flood begins, so all the fountains of the great deep are broken up, Genesis 7:11. So they break apart, keeping in mind that the fountains of the deep here may be talking about fountains of more than just water. This could be fountains of other material from below the earth. So according to simulations, something causes the breakup of the crust, including the cold, dense ocean floor. Okay, the ocean floor is very dense, it's going to be very cold. So it breaks the crust apart in several places, including breaking the ocean plates away from the continental plates. Breaks that apart. Now, according to simulations, when you do that, you break these boundaries between, for example, the continental plates and the ocean plates. A phenomenon happens called, it's subduction, but it's thermal runaway subduction, where basically the sea floor instead of the creeping rate that it's moving now, it starts diving into the mantle at the beginning of the flood on the order of meters per second, as fast as you could run across this auditorium. Well, back in 1994, when this was being developed, creation scientists made a scientific prediction, okay? This is important in science, the ability to, this isn't a prophecy. What this is if you have a scientific theory, one of the ways you test that is you say, well, if this is true, if this happened, then we should find this. We predict that if we do this or go search for this, this is what we're going to find. So they made a scientific prediction. If creationists were right, then the ocean floor would have dove into the mantle and been completely made, like new ocean floor had to have been completely remade. If that was the case, all that material would be diving down to the mantle. What would happen? Well, if the secular geologists are right, and uniformitarianism is true, then as the plates have always moved as slow as they do today, so as it's moving down, what's going to happen? Well, the front edge is going to melt in the mantle and get recycled. But if we're right, this happened quickly a few thousand years ago. All of that ocean floor is diving down into the mantle, and it hasn't had enough time to melt and get recycled. So there should be enormous amounts of pre-flood material under subduction zones piled up down there, probably at the base of the mantle. So this was a specific prediction that would show uniformitarian geology is false, it can't explain the evidence. Creation geology, it's exactly what we predict. So that was the prediction. But there wasn't the technology yet to study what was going on down there and actually get the evidence that creationists needed until about 3 years later. 3 years later, we finally developed the technology to be able to take seismic images of the mantle's density structure, and it verified creationist predictions and showed there's evidence of enormous piles of cooler slabs of material in the mantle, specifically under subduction zones where they should be, apparently remnants of the pre-flood ocean crust piled up there. So this rapid diving, what's going to happen as these plates converge and you've got this rapid diving of the ocean floor moving into the mantle. So the supercontinent breaks up and all the crust is moving quickly. So this is going to cause the rapid formation of mountains and volcanoes along convergence and subduction zones. And so you picture now a conveyor belt. So the ocean floor is diving into the mantle. What happens on the other side of this plate? Well, you've got a divergence zone where two plates are moving apart. So you've got new material from the mantle coming up as lava that now is going to come up and hit what? The ocean. Okay, so what happens when you throw water on a campfire? Well, it immediately superheats that liquid water, turns it into steam, right? So the lava comes up to make new ocean floor. It hits the ocean water and immediately creates steam jets, evaporated water along these divergent zones that are all over the earth and many of which are in the oceans. This would have caused intense rain around the globe as these geysers that stretch for hundreds of miles across the ocean erupt huge amounts of water up into the atmosphere that comes back down from the heavens onto the land. You now also have added magma on the sea floor that's creating new ocean crust there. And it is going to be higher than the ocean floor, so it is now going to start pushing water from the oceans onto the land. So this is hot material replacing the pre-flood ocean floor, which was cold and dense. What happens when you heat things? They expand. Water is the one weird exception to that. But most things, when you heat them, they expand. So you've got the entire ocean floor being remade with really hot material that's in an expanded state until it cools and forms rock. So it's in a hotter, expanded state, it's lighter. So essentially the ocean floor, as it's being overturned, is riding higher in the mantle. It's gradually pushing the sea floor up as it's remaking the ocean floor. Creation geologists estimate at its peak, we're talking the entire ocean floor was 3,500 feet or higher than it is now. So as the sea floor is raising, water from the seas is spilling onto the continents, carrying with it sea creatures, explaining why you have marine animals, not just along the coasts, to what are today coasts, but we're talking in the middle of continents, way away from the ocean, where there's no way for it to get there. And even on what are today mountains, keeping in mind that they weren't mountains at that point. The mountains aren't forming until all this is going on. So you get marine creatures across an area, and then the mountains form, pushing those up into the sky. So the argument that's compelling is that you've got marine creatures in the middle of continents. There is no natural way to get the ocean all the way over the continents. That's a whole other discussion. So water's coming in from the ocean as the sea level is rising. Water's coming down from these geysers. This is causing massive earthquakes. What happens when you have an earthquake underwater? Tsunamis. And these aren't modern day tsunamis. These are mega tsunamis that are destroying the surface of the pre-flood continents and totally eroding any of the pre-flood crust and then dispersing it across the entire continents due to these tsunamis. So most of the water from the flood, notice, is coming from the oceans. Now keep in mind, while all this is going on, meteorites are hitting the earth. So I found a simulation of what secular geologists think the land configurations have been in the past. And there's a lot of debate about that, but this may be accurate in its depiction of where the continents were in the past and how they moved. They just are thinking in terms of millions and millions of years, but if you eliminate the time frame, it actually we would say the bulk of that movement is going on during the flood. And also keep in mind that I'm going to show you the simulation, but a lot of this is underwater while it's happening. Like Pangea never actually sees the light. It forms during the flood. Rodinia breaks apart, forms Pangea underwater and never actually sees the light. And so I took all of the known meteorite impacts from the flood, where they struck the earth, and added them to the simulation, showing approximately when and where the meteorites would have struck during the flood. And you keep in mind, these are only the craters that have been discovered so far, which tend to be on land, right? Because that's where we can find them. This is not ocean craters. So any meteorites that struck the ocean wouldn't have left craters as easily, and we wouldn't be able to find them as easily. And in fact, a lot of them would be down in the mantle now because the ocean floor gets pushed down there. So in order to get a better idea of how many meteorites are actually striking the earth, you got to add all the ocean meteorites and trying to do math on that. If you've got 100 meteorite craters that have been found on land that correlate to the flood, 70% of the surface of the earth is ocean. And so if we just assume it was the same amount hitting the oceans too, you have to add another 230 more meteorite impacts. So we're talking over 330 massive meteorites striking the earth during the flood. This is clearly a significant part of this event. Look at Psalm 104 now. You covered the earth with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Now, in light of verse 9, this seems to be referring to the flood, not creation week. Otherwise, this passage would have been violated during the flood because the water does come back over the earth again. So if we assume this is talking about the flood, then it makes perfect sense. So catastrophic plate tectonics would say that the high mountains are forming during the flood as these plates are racing around, smashing into each other. So now, due to the formation of the mountains in the flood, a boundary has been created where water can no longer again cover the earth anymore like that because the mountains are too high. So that would not, you wouldn't be able to do. You'd have to erode the entire mountain systems all the way down before you could do that again. And so by the mountains rising and the valleys sinking, a boundary was set for the water that it might not again cover the earth. According to the text, the rain itself continues for 40 uninterrupted days and nights, and that may be that initial period of geyser activity that's referring to, but that's not the extent of the catastrophe. The waters apparently continued to rise for some time after that, and this would be due probably to the ocean floor being completely overhauled gradually. And so the rising waters eventually level out, maybe when the ocean floor is totally overhauled, and that is 5 months into the flood. Imagine that. The waters continue to rise for 5 months, keeping in mind some of the animals are still alive because we find their fossilized footprints. And we're talking like, the dinosaurs, like up in the Cretaceous. So this is towards the end of the flood. The dinosaurs, like T-Rex, their footprints are still there. They're still alive, weeks and weeks. There's hundreds, like just the material at Grand Canyon from where the flood starts up to the rim, which doesn't even get you to the end of the flood, is a mile of sediment. And it would keep going up above that, maybe another mile. And the dinosaurs are up there. They're still alive. Weeks and weeks into this event, they're experiencing all this stuff going on. And during this period, typical Earth processes, seasons, day and night, and so forth, are totally disrupted, of course. And after the flood, God promises He's not going to allow that to happen again on a global scale. So the disruption of seasons we would expect from what we've looked at here. Cloud cover from not just water, but the volcanic ash and aerosols that are in the air. You've got meteorites causing atmospheric debris. As meteorites hit the ground, it's going to cause a lot of material to be thrown up into the atmosphere. So day and night are blocking, it's gone from the blocking of sunlight from all this that's going on. Obviously, seed time and harvest are going to be stopped. All right, so let's return to the question then. How could the flood be global? I mean, how could there be enough water to cover the earth, prevailing over the mountains over 20 feet? Well, with this model that I've laid out, first of all, you can see the value of having a scientific model like this. But also, and one of the reasons is because it helps you to answer some of these type of questions. So let's think about the science side first of all. Remember that catastrophic plate tectonics would say that the water came primarily from the seas, both in the form of enormous geysers and in the form of the sea level rising as the ocean floor is being overhauled. And keeping in mind Psalm 104, the taller mountains are forming during the flood. We recall that they're forming as the plates are smashing into each other, which means the pre-flood world would have likely been much flatter, remember, which makes it a lot easier to cover the pre-flood world with water. So it wouldn't have been nearly as hard to cover the earth with water because the taller mountains aren't formed until the flood, and specifically later in the flood, when the recession begins, that's when the mountains finally get to a height where they start poking up out of the water. So you picture a flatter earth with a lower elevation covering the highest points on the earth by day even 40. Wouldn't require anywhere near the amount of water it would require today. All right, so where did all the water go afterwards? Well, you can think through that too. And there's several factors here. The ocean floor is rising during the flood, and you've got all this geyser activity going on. The tsunamis are bringing material from the ocean and dumping all of that onto the continents. And so already that's raising the continents relative to pre-flood times. The mountains are forming at convergent zones. That causes those areas to be higher as well. But the bigger factor here is you keep in mind that the ocean floor is diving into the mantle. New material is replacing it. That material is hotter, so it's in an expanded state. It's less dense. And so it is causing the entire ocean floor to be in higher in elevation, pushing a lot of that water onto the land. Now, once that conveyor belt process stops, the ocean floor is going to start cooling. All right, and as it cools, it's now going to condense again. So where's all the water going to go? It's going to go right back to the ocean from where it came from due to the seafloor cooling. So that allows the water to go. So bottom line is there's no problem from science in explaining where the water would have come from and where it went. It actually fits the scientific evidence well. And there's other evidences. This has to be global. The Cambrian explosion, you remember? Remember I showed you a chart here where I showed you where the flood begins and ends. And at the very base are what they call the Cambrian rock layers. And it's a major problem for evolution. It does not fit evolutionary predictions, because if evolution is true, what you should see at the very bottom of the rock layers are simple single-celled organisms, and then in the layers above them they get a little more complex, and they gradually turn into all the diversity we see today. But with the flood, or the fossil record begins, to all intents and purposes, at the Cambrian, and it's an explosion of fully formed, functional, and even diverse, complex life. They call it the Cambrian explosion. It's exactly what we'd expect, and it totally falsifies evolution. It's a major problem. They don't have an explanation for it. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould is probably the leading paleontologist of the 20th century, a Harvard guy. He spent his life trying to figure out an explanation for the Cambrian explosion that would not falsify evolution. And he died without an explanation. They've got no explanation for this. It makes perfect sense from our perspective. You have an explosion not just in one area of the earth, but across the entire planet. You have a worldwide explosion of fossils that begin at the base of the fossil record as though some kind of major catastrophe happened that was worldwide. And right below that, you have this massive erosion surface that goes across the whole planet called the Great Unconformity. Something happens to cut off the entire surface of the earth and then start depositing fossils everywhere at the same time. Major worldwide global catastrophe. That's an explosion of life. And then long distance travel of sediment. So when you look at the material found in the rock layers of the geologic column, like the Grand Canyon, you got to bring the kids out there and show them the Grand Canyon. They get to see with their own eyes what we're talking about here. When you think about the material in the Grand Canyon, there's different material there, and they think, okay, that material was deposited there from a source somewhere else, and it was carried there and deposited. Some of the material, the only source that they can figure out is hundreds or thousands of miles away. Okay, now wind and water today on a local level, they can erode and carry material short distances, maybe in a few miles, but hundreds or thousands of miles? Okay, there's material in Grand Canyon that they think comes from New York and Pennsylvania. And it went across the whole planet, and it not only was deposited in Grand Canyon, it's not just like a little layer. We're talking about final deposits that are hundreds of feet in thickness, taller than this ceiling. And it somehow gets across the entire continent and gets dumped there. Now again, this suggests huge global phenomenon going on here that involves a lot of water to transport all of that. Because one of the things we look at Grand Canyon, we find evidence that this was deposited as fast-moving mud flows. Because we can look at the nature of the fossils, they're like the nautiloid beds, and we can study their orientations, and we can figure out these were really fast mud flows that had to be carrying this material and depositing it there. This is not uniformitarianism. This is catastrophic, continent-wide deposition going on that involves a lot of water. So this again demands the flood can't be local. This is a global thing going on. You have megaseismites. Okay, whenever, and I've done a lot of study out in Wyoming on seismites. Whenever you have major earthquakes today, and you have wet sediment, like let's say sand, and an earthquake happens, it'll shake that sand up and make it all kind of squiggly. These are called fluid avulsion structures. It makes convolutions. And then if that goes ahead and cements, lithifies, becomes a rock layer, it'll keep all that shaked up, but shaken up shape to it. That's called a seismite from the earthquake. And we find those today, they're a few inches thick. In Wyoming, in the flood layers, we find seismites that are as tall as this ceiling. Okay, megaseismites. We're talking earthquakes that are so powerful that there is no modern reference point to even understand them. They're so huge. So you have to picture plates smashing into each other really fast, forming, for example, the Rocky Mountains that are right out there in Wyoming, right? That are probably creating these massive seismites that are shooting across the continent. Again, megaseismites suggest continent-wide catastrophe going on. Other evidences. Talked about the Cambrian explosion, where we think the flood starts. This is the point, the base of the Paleozoic, the beginning of the fossil record. So it's not just the fossils that show up there, they're worldwide deposits of material like sandstone. Okay, whenever material gets laid down today, it's local. Everything, all the catastrophes that are happening are local. And so you'll have deposits of material, right? Over here we've got sand, and you go a few miles over here, and oh, this is mud over here. You got different kind. No, these are worldwide deposits of the same material. Okay, you find a layer of sandstone over here, and then you jump across the pond, and the same sandstone layer continues, and on top of it, a totally different layer of the same kind of material, and it does the same thing over here in this continent, and they keep going like that. You've got worldwide deposits of the same kind of sediment as you go through these layers in the geologic column that start at the Cambrian explosion and go all the way up to the point that we think it ends at the end of the Cretaceous. And as you would expect, the dominant rock type throughout all of those is sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is formed from water processes. Okay, exactly what you'd expect. If the flood is, so you have to picture a worldwide water-forming event depositing enormous amounts of sediment across the entire planet. You see what I'm saying? This has to be global. You can't argue that this is local from science. So then when you move from science and look at the Bible, of course the Bible doesn't allow a local interpretation either. Very quickly, notice, if this is a local flood, why in the world do you take maybe a century to build an ark? Why not just leave the area? I mean, why would you waste all that time? And why in the world do you bring animals from all over the place, keeping in mind that God is sending the animals anyway? Why wouldn't he just send them out of the area? It makes no sense. And how would the ark be able to stay afloat for several months? I mean, the ark is big, okay? And it stays afloat for several months, and this is local? And how would the biblical terminology that over and over and over describes the water is covering the whole earth, the high mountains under the whole heaven? It has all of this kind of terminology that demands, this is huge. How do you even get water high enough locally to cover what would be deemed a mountain if this isn't greater in its extent? How could the biblically stated purpose of wiping man from the face of the earth, how could that be accomplished with a local flood, including all the animals too? No animals survive from the local flood? That doesn't fit. And if the flood was local, this is important, then God lied. because he promised he was never going to destroy the earth again with a flood like the one he did. Do local floods happen today? Yeah, they happen. And he said that's not going to happen anymore. Well, a global flood can't happen anymore. He's made sure of that. But local floods happen. Of course, Peter used the universal destruction of the earth and the flood to describe what Judgment Day is going to be like. So if the flood wasn't universal, then is judgment not going to be universal? And also, why would the seasons have been affected if this is just a local flood? Where you've got seed time, harvest, winter, summer, and even day and night stopped for an entire year? This doesn't sound local. And why does the dove find no resting place for the sole of her foot when doves can travel immense distances? And yet this dove's not being able to find a place? So the Bible doesn't leave room for a local flood interpretation, and neither does science. So basically what I get out of this, if you don't want to accept the local flood, you're going to have a blind faith in something else. But it's not going to have to do with the Bible. The Bible demands, and science demands, the global flood that is described there. So, very different portrait, maybe, of what we oftentimes think about in our minds of what occurred in this event, right? And, maybe the big difference is there'd probably be a lot more red in this water, right? This was a bloody event. This was no pleasure cruise for Noah and his family. Really, you don't even want to be on the ark. You don't want to be anywhere. You want to be on a different planet. But that's a problem too, because we've now found that there's evidence that the whole solar system is affected by what's going on here. That's another question. All right. I keep forgetting to tell you, be sure if you have any questions, surely this has made you wonder some things, right? Be thinking about that, jotting those down, because we do have a Q&A at some point today, this afternoon, I guess. And so that's always fun, lots of fun questions that people come up with on that. So be sure to jot those down, and maybe during the Q&A we'll have time to look at those. All right, we're done. Appreciate your attention again. Jason, I'm handing it to you. I think we're 15 minutes ahead, aren't we?
And sharing all that research and the implications for our love and appreciation for the Bible and what it teaches us as well. So we'll break now. We'll look forward to some lunch. We can head over to the fellowship hall, and let's conclude our morning session with a prayer. Jeff Krantz, would you come and direct us in a prayer, please?
Let's bow. Thank you so much, dear God, for this day and the good information that we've gathered today. We're thankful, Father, for all the information that we have learned that proves that you are who you are, that things happen the way the Bible says they did, and science even proves that. We're thankful, Father, for these things that we can learn that fortifies our faith in who you are and what we are to do while we're here on this earth. Thank you, Father, for Brother Jeff and the good information that he has given us. We thank you, Father, for Apologetics Press and the way that they are able to give us information in a manner that's easily understandable. And we thank you, Father, for all the blessings of life that you poured upon us. We thank you, Father, for each person here during our seminar. We ask, Father, that you bless each of us as we strive to do your will while we're here on this earth. Thank you again, Father, for this day. May we be blessing to those around those that we know, and each person here will be blessed. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.